Last time, we left Caesar at 25. No official position, no army, freshly back from crucifying his kidnappers, and absolutely certain that he was going somewhere. This episode covers the decade that turns that certainty into reality. Caesar climbs Rome's political ladder, spends money he doesn't have on a scale that would make a modern government blush, gets tangled in one of the most gloriously absurd religious scandals in Roman history, and somewhere along the way breaks down crying in front of a statue. It's also the decade where he starts making the kind of friends and enemies that will define the rest of his life. Let's get into it. Before we go any further, a very quick word on how Roman politics actually worked, because it matters for everything that follows. The Roman Republic had a strict career ladder called the cursus honorum, Latin for the course of honors. To reach the top job, the consulship, you had to climb through a series of offices in order: quaestor, then aedile, then praetor, then, if you were very good, very lucky, and very well connected, consul. Each office had a minimum age. You couldn't skip steps, you couldn't rush it, or at least that was the idea. Caesar would test those rules fairly thoroughly. Around 73 BCE, Caesar was elected to a vacancy in the College of Pontifices, one of Rome's prestigious religious bodies. It was a useful connection that signaled he was being taken seriously. Then, he served as a military tribune, the first formal step on the ladder. He was building his reputation, one rung at a time. In 69 BCE, Caesar was elected quaestor, a financial magistrate, and assigned to the province of Further Spain, in what is now southern Andalusia. It was a junior posting, exactly what you'd expect at this stage. But before he even left Rome, two things happened that Caesar turned into political gold. His aunt Julia, widow of the great general Marius, died. And shortly afterwards, his wife Cornelia, who had stood by him through the Sulla years, also died after giving birth to their daughter Julia. Caesar gave public funeral orations for both women. At his aunt's funeral, he did something bold. He displayed the images of Marius, a man whose memory had been officially suppressed since Sulla's dictatorship. It was a statement. Caesar was saying loudly and in public, "I am the heir to Marius. I belong to the people's side. Remember who I am." A bold proclamation, to say the least. Rome noticed. Caesar headed to Spain to serve out his quaestorship. And while he was there, in the city of Gades, which is modern-day Cadiz, he came across a statue of Alexander the Great in a temple. And according to both Plutarch and Suetonius, he wept. When his friends asked why, because Alexander at his age had already conquered so many nations, and he himself had done nothing memorable. Caesar was 32. Alexander had conquered most of the known world and died by 32. Now, is this story polished and embellished by later writers? Probably yes. But it tells us something real about Caesar. The ambition was always there, enormous and restless. And even at this early stage, he measured himself against the greatest conquerors in history. He wasn't aiming for a comfortable senatorial career. He was aiming for something else entirely. He just hadn't figured out how to get there yet. He was about to start figuring it out. Caesar returned from Spain, married his second wife Pompeia, a granddaughter of his old enemy Sulla, which tells you something about Caesar's pragmatic approach to politics, and set about making himself famous. In Roman politics, fame was not optional. If the people didn't know your name, you couldn't win elections. If you couldn't win elections, you couldn't advance. And the most reliable way to make the people of Rome love you was simple: give them a spectacular show. In 65 BCE, Caesar was elected aedile, the office responsible for public buildings, the grain supply, and most importantly, public games and festivals. It was, in effect, the office of putting on entertainment for the city. And Caesar treated it like a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. He spent an absolutely staggering amount of money. He decorated the Forum and the Capitoline Hill. He staged theatrical performances and public banquets. And then there were the gladiatorial games. He put on a spectacle featuring 320 pairs of gladiators, all equipped, according to ancient sources, in gleaming silver armor. 320 pairs, 640 gladiators in silver armor. The Senate was so alarmed by the sheer scale of it that they passed a law capping the number of gladiators any individual could bring to Rome. Caesar had accidentally triggered gladiator regulation. He also, during the same period as aedile, had the trophies of his uncle Marius torn down after Sulla's victory, quietly restored and put back on the Capitol. When Romans woke up and saw them gleaming there in the morning, there were reportedly tears of joy in the crowds, and a lot of grumbling from Caesar's enemies, who saw exactly what he was doing. The question you are probably asking is, how did he pay for any of this? The answer is, he didn't. Not yet. By the time Caesar entered public life in earnest, he was already deeply in debt. Plutarch records that before he held any public office, he owed around 1,300 talents, an almost incomprehensible sum. The games, the restorations, the constant entertaining, all of it went on borrowed money. His creditor of choice was a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus, widely regarded as the richest person in Rome, possibly the richest man in the entire ancient world. Crassus had made his fortune in real estate, among other ventures, and he had a sharp eye for political investments. He looked at Caesar, deeply popular, wildly ambitious, catastrophically in debt, and decided he was worth backing. It was one of the more consequential financial decisions in Roman history. In 63 BCE, the position of Pontifex Maximus came open. This was the chief priest of Rome, head of the entire state religion, controller of the religious calendar, and occupant of an official residence right on the Roman Forum. It was one of the most prestigious positions in the Republic, normally held by senior gray-haired senators who had spent decades earning it. Caesar, aged 36, decided to run for it. His opponents were two of the most powerful and respected men in Rome. Everyone expected him to lose. His enemies were delighted at what they assumed would be a humiliating defeat. Even his own allies were nervous. Caesar borrowed even more money on top of his already enormous debts, and spent it all on bribing voters. The scale of the bribery was, by Roman standards, remarkable, and Roman standards for bribery were already quite generous. On the morning of the election, according to Suetonius, Caesar kissed his mother goodbye and told her that he would come home either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all. He was preparing to flee Rome if he lost, because he would not be able to pay his debts. He won. Caesar moved into the official residence on the Forum, a significant upgrade from his previous address in the rough Subura district where he had grown up. He was now Rome's chief priest. He had a house in the most important square in the world's most powerful city. His enemies, watching all of this, were becoming increasingly worried. This man, popular, relentless, seemingly unkillable, just kept winning. The same year, Rome was rocked by the Catilinarian conspiracy, a plot by a senator named Catiline to violently seize power. The conspiracy was uncovered by the consul Cicero, who had the conspirators arrested and executed. Caesar, in the Senate debate, argued for a more moderate punishment, imprisonment rather than death. He was outvoted. The men were executed, and Caesar's argument was noted and remembered by his enemies as being too soft. It wouldn't be the last time he and Cicero found themselves on opposite sides. Now, we need to talk about the Bona Dea. The Bona Dea, the good goddess, was a Roman deity associated with fertility and chastity. Once a year, in December, an exclusive religious ceremony in her honor was held in the home of a senior Roman magistrate. The ceremony was conducted entirely by women, elite Roman matrons led by the host's wife, with the Vestal virgins in attendance. No men were allowed. Not in the house, not near the house, not even the male servants. Absolute zero men. In December of 62 BCE, the ceremony was held at Caesar's home as Pontifex Maximus. His residence was the official venue. His wife, Pompeia, was the hostess. Caesar himself, following the rules, had left the house. Enter Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was a young, reckless, ambitious patrician politician with a talent for causing chaos. He was also, according to most ancient sources, engaged in an affair, or attempting one, with Caesar's wife, Pompeia. On the night of the Bona Dea ceremony, Clodius disguised himself as a woman in what ancient sources describe as a yellow saffron gown, a long-sleeved tunic, a turban-style headdress, women's sandals, and crimson ribbons, and attempted to sneak into the ceremony. He was discovered by Caesar's mother, Aurelia, who was, by all accounts, an extremely sharp woman, and then by a slave who heard his voice and raised the alarm. Clodius was chased out of the house. The scandal that followed was enormous. A man had violated the sacred rites of the Bona Dea, in the home of the Pontifex Maximus, no less. This was not just socially embarrassing. In Roman religious thinking, it was a potential offense to the gods, with consequences for the whole city. The Vestal virgins had to repeat the entire ceremony to cleanse it. Clodius was brought to trial on charges of sacrilege, which could carry the death penalty. Caesar's response to all of this was masterfully evasive. He publicly maintained that his wife was innocent, and then immediately divorced her. When asked at the trial why he had divorced an innocent woman, he delivered one of the most famous lines in Roman history, that the members of his family should be free from suspicion, as well as from accusation. Or, in the version most people know, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. He then refused to testify against Clodius at the trial. Why? Because Clodius, despite being an absolute menace, was popular with the Roman masses, exactly the kind of ally Caesar needed. Caesar quietly let Crassus fund the jury bribery that got Clodius acquitted. Clodius walked free. Caesar got a useful ally. Pompeia got divorced for something she may well have had nothing to do with. Cicero, who had testified for the prosecution and was furious at the acquittal, made a powerful new enemy in Clodius. That particular grudge would have consequences well beyond this episode. Rome, for its part, found the whole thing hilarious. Commentators noted the irony that Caesar, famous for his own extramarital affairs, had just been, as it were, on the receiving end. Even his enemies were laughing. By 61 BCE, Caesar was broke. Spectacularly, comprehensively broke. The games, the bribes, the constant political spending. It had all caught up with him. When he was assigned to go to Spain as governor of the province of Further Spain, his creditors literally showed up at the docks to try to stop him from leaving. They began attaching his baggage, which obviously did not work. Crassus stepped in again like a dad, personally guaranteeing 830 talents of Caesar's debts. That's, according to Plutarch's Life of Crassus, from the primary source. This allowed Caesar to depart. In Spain, something shifted. Caesar launched military campaigns against local tribes, won significant victories, earned the loyalty of his troops, and, crucially, acquired actual money. War was profitable in the ancient world if you won it. Caesar won it. For the first time in his adult life, he was solvent. He returned to Rome in 60 BCE with something he hadn't had before: military glory, a loyal army, filled coffers, and the beginning of a plan. The plan involved two other men: Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general who had recently returned from a triumphant campaign in the East and was being blocked by the Senate, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome who wanted political influence to match his wealth. Caesar looked at these two men, who privately despised each other, and thought, what if I put them together? What could go wrong? And that is Caesar at 39. He has climbed from a young man with a famous name and no money to the chief priest of Rome, a senator, a celebrated aedile, a war hero, and a man with the beginnings of the most dangerous political alliance the Republic has ever seen. He is still deeply in debt. He still has powerful enemies who would love nothing more than to prosecute him the moment he leaves office. He still needs a bigger stage. In part 3, he gets it. Caesar becomes consul, Rome's highest elected office, and the first triumvirate turns the Roman political system upside down. After that, he heads north into Gaul with an army, and things are about to get very large, very violent, and very consequential for the history of the entire Western world. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you're enjoying the series, and we'll see you in part 3.